G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Book of Acts. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. Last week, Paul he's before the mob. We're in Acts. We're looking at chapter 23, verse 16 to chapter 24, verse 21 today. Last week, where did we leave off? Paul is before the mob, defending himself against, there was an accusation by the Ephesian Jews that he brought a Gentile into the inner court. In his defense, he tells the mob of his conversion experience and his commission, but the moment he mentions about Gentile conversions, off they go again, and they get all stirred up again. Because remember, Paul was converting the Gentiles without conforming to the Mosaic law, and the Jews were not happy with that. So he's taken into the Antonia fortress where he's about to be flogged until they realize he's a Roman citizen. Sanhedrin are called to explain to the chief captain what's going on, because he doesn't know what all this big fuss is about. He doesn't know the root cause of it all, and so he calls the Sanhedrin to a bit of a meeting in the Antonia fortress, where Paul gives his defense to those members of the Sanhedrin who are there. As we know that in amongst the Sanhedrin we have Sadducees and Pharisees, and Paul, realizing as he kicks off he won't get a very fair hearing from him, what he does is because they're Sadducees and Pharisees, what he does is he brings up the resurrection. And really, the whole of our gospel message centers around the resurrection of Jesus Christ anyway. So he brings up the resurrection. There's now dissension among the Pharisees and the Sadducees. The Pharisees are backing Paul, all up in the air. And so Paul has to be taken out of that mob by the chief captain for his own protection. And in the meantime, while he's in the Antonia fortress, there's a conspiracy being developed. We have 40 plus men. They bind themselves to a curse when eat or drink until they kill Paul. And they then approach the Sanhedrin, the chief priests in the Sanhedrin, with this conspiracy. And they said, right, this is how we're going to do it. You need to get Paul down here so we can kill him. So this sets things in motion to where we are today. Okay. And we have the report of the conspiracy in chapter 23, verses 16 to 22. But Paul's sister heard of their lying in wait, and he came and entered into the castle. Paul's sister's son, heard of their lying in wait. He came and entered into the castle and told Paul. And Paul called unto him one of the centurions and said, bring this young man unto the chief captain, for he has something to tell him. So he took him and brought him to the chief captain and said, Paul the prisoner called me unto him and asked me to bring this young man unto you, who has something to say to you. The chief captain took him by the hand and going aside asked him privately, what is it that you have to tell me? And he said, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring down Paul tomorrow unto the council, as though you would inquire somewhat more exactly concerning him. Do not you therefore yield unto them, for there lie in wait for him of them more than 40 men, who have bound themselves under a curse, neither to eat or drink till they have slain him. And now are they ready, looking for the promise from you. So the chief captain let the young man go, charging him, tell no man that you have signified these things to me. So we have the report from Paul's nephew to Paul in verse 16. So it's Paul's sister's son. Obviously, he had a sister living in Jerusalem, and he heard of their lying in wait. The Greek word enedreo for lying in wait means ambush. The exact way he knew about it, it says he came in. The Greek literally means having been present. So this may mean that the nephew was with the conspirators when the conspiracy was hatched. If that's true, then Paul's nephew was a bit of a zealot. It may also mean that someone had told him of the plot for one reason or another. So bringing this report, he came, he entered in the castle, and he told Paul. Now, prisoners of high rank, such as Paul with his Roman citizenship, were often given a great deal of liberty for visits from family and friends, which we see here. So he's in the fortress. Now, so Paul, what did he do? In verses 17 to 22, we have the report of the chief captain, the chiliarch. In verse 17, Paul now speaks to the centurion. And Paul called unto him one of the centurions and said, bring this young man unto the chief captain. Why? Because he's got something to tell the chief captain. Now, Paul must have had some considerable standing as he's able here. We see he's able to summons the centurion over to himself and give the centurion directions. The centurion didn't kick up or anything. He just, okay, I'll do what you tell me. This is a centurion in charge of 100 soldiers. And in verse 18, we have the centurion now relays to the chiliarch, and he brings a young man, this nephew. He's somewhere, the word for young man here means he's somewhere between 20 and 40 years old. So he brings him across to the chief captain and said, Paul, the prisoner, called me unto him. Notice we see here, the title is Paul the prisoner. So obviously he was a well-known prisoner in the Antonia fortress, in light of all the things which have been happening in Jerusalem. He said, Paul had asked me to bring this young man unto you who has something to say to you. And in verse 19, we have now the banter between the chief captain, the chiliarch, and the nephew. And the chief captain takes him by the hand and going aside privately says, come on, mate, now, what do you got to tell me? What is it you have to tell me? And so obviously what we see here is that the chiliarch realized that what the nephew had to say, obviously it's confidential. We need to keep this between ourselves. In verses 20 to 21, we have now the nephew, he now tells the plan of the Sanhedrin. We see that in verse 20. He said, the Jews, that's the Jewish leadership, the Jews have agreed to ask thee to bring down Paul tomorrow onto the council. That's the Sanhedrin council. So they agreed together to ask the chief captain to bring Paul where they would normally meet, the judgment hall, and that's down in the temple area. And the reason that they give is, so that we can sort it out so you can understand more exactly concerning Paul. We're going to give you some more information when you bring him down to us. And in verse 21, what we see here is the nephew now reveals the plot. And his advice to them is, he says, do not you therefore yield unto them. Don't go along with this request. And the reason is because there is lying in wait for him more than 40 men. So there's an ambush being set. More than 40 men are waiting in ambush to ambush Paul when you bring him down. And these men, he said, have bound themselves under a curse, that they were neither to eat nor drink until they had killed Paul. All they needed to do is to get the plot moving. They just need your consent to allow this to happen so we can get the plot moving so that they can kill him. And so the chief captain, he lets the young nephew go and he says, listen, tell nobody about this conversation. Tell nobody about these things. So he dismisses him. Now, just as I was looking back on Paul's life, Paul's life has been in danger from the very start of his ministry when he witnessed for Christ in Damascus. And then, during his first visit to Jerusalem after his conversion in Jerusalem, the Hellenistic Jews tried to kill him in Acts 9. The Jews, the non-believing Jews, drive him out of Antioch in Pisidia in Acts 13. And they threatened to stone him in Iconium in Acts 14. Paul was actually stoned in Lystra in Acts 14. And in Corinth, we see that the Jews tried to get him arrested. In Ephesus, the Jews had a plot to kill him, and they even planned to kill him at sea in Acts 20. Paul has a big target on his back, doesn't he? But yet, he has a mission, and the mission is the overriding influence here. So he called unto him 2 of the centurions and said, make ready 200 soldiers to go as far as Caesarea, and horsemen 70 and spearmen 200 at the 3rd hour of the night. And he bade them provide beasts that they might set Paul thereon and bring him safe unto Felix the governor. That's his verses 23 and 24 of chapter 23. So we see the preparation. So they're getting ready to head off. They're going to head off to Caesarea. So we have 2 centurions. All up, what we see here is he has 470 man escort. That's what he's going to have. 470 men. We have 2 centurions. So we have divided into 3 groups here. 200 soldiers. That's the 2 centurions. One each has 100. And these soldiers here are the heavily armed legionnaires. And then we have 70 horsemen, which is a cavalry, and these cavalry were attached to every Roman legion. And then we had 200 spearmen, and these were the lightly armed supplementary troops who carried a lance or a spear in their right hand. So this gives Paul an escort of 470 men, and that's almost half the size of the garrison in the Antonia fortress. When were they going to leave? They're going to leave at 9 o'clock, between 9 and 10 o'clock at night. So it's an urgent mission, so that the chief captain needs to get Paul out of Jerusalem as quickly as he can. And they were told to give Paul an animal so we can ride, so we can get him to Felix the governor as quick as we can. Now, we're now introduced to Felix. Felix is the governor. He plays a major role in Acts chapter 24. Just a little bit about Felix from secular sources. He was the corrupt brother of Pallas. Now, both Pallas and Felix were formerly slaves who became freedmen under Claudius. Claudius is the emperor, and they were childhood friends of Claudius. Obviously, they grew up together. They were slaves in the household of Claudius and his mother Antonia. Earlier, Felix had served as a subordinate rule over Samaria under a previous procurator called Cumanus between 48 and 52 AD. He was appointed procurator by Claudius in the year 52 AD, and that was because his brother Pallas influenced Claudius. So he went from slavery to procuratorship, becoming a procurator. He was the 11th procurator, and he served from 52 to 59. And there's a Roman historian, Tacitus. There's no love lost between Tacitus and Felix. He writes that Felix exercised the power of a king with the mind of a slave. So in other words, he wasn't very impressed with Felix. Now, Felix was married to 3 princesses at the time of Paul, 3 wives. So he had 3 royal wives, and while in office, he also fell in love with a woman in the book of Acts called Drusilla. Now, Drusilla had previously been married to Accusers, who was a king of Emesa. In actual fact, Drusilla was the daughter of Agrippa I, and she was a sister of Agrippa II. And Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us that she was persuaded to leave Accusers and marry Felix through the influence of Simon the sorcerer from Cyprus. And she married Felix at the age of 16. Now, Felix was a very cruel ruler. He was a despot. He actually had assassinated Jonathan the high priest because Jonathan the high priest criticized the way he was ruling the area. And so he had him assassinated by those people we met last week, the Sicarii, the dagger men. Now he was extremely corrupt and famous for his lust. Now we have a letter of explanation coming from Claudius Lysias to Felix. We see this in verse 25. He wrote a letter after this form. Actually, just going back a bit, it wasn't the Caesarea who killed him. It was his own henchmen who killed Jonathan the high priest. Now, he wrote a letter after this form. What is it when it says after this form? All it's simply saying is it means that this wasn't the actual verbatim text of the letter. This is basically what he wrote. Now, Claudius writes a letter which has a little bit of truth and error mixed in it. And we see the content of the letter in verses 26 to 30. We have the salutation in verse 26, Claudius Lysias, unto the most excellent governor Felix. Greeting. So Claudius Lysias, Lysias is Greek name, Claudius is Roman name. Once he purchased his Roman citizenship, he took on a Roman name, and that was Claudius. That's his Latin name. Okay. Now why did he take on the term Claudius? Because Claudius was the one who he bought his citizenship from. So he became Claudius Lysias. So the recipient is the most excellent governor Felix. And this is the way all of these letters are normally written. And he writes, this man, Paul, was seized by the Jews and was about to be slain of them when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. Now, mainly true, but there's a little bit of error in that. And we see the mixture of truth and error here. So he describes his rescue of Paul in verse 27, and he mentions 5 things in his letter. First of all, he says that this man was seized by the Jews. Well, that's true. He was seized by the Jews. Second, he was about to be slain by them. Yes, they were going to kill him. That's also true. And third, he says he came upon them with the soldiers. That was also true. Because remember, the Antonia fortress overlooked the temple compound, so they could see exactly what's going on down there. When they saw this kebab happening, they shot the soldiers down there. Fourth, he rescued Paul. That's also true. Fifth, he learned that he was a Roman. Well, this is not quite true. This was a little bit false. He discovered that he was a Roman only after the rescue. He leaves out the fact that he gave an order to have Paul scourged. So Claudius Lysias, what he did was he simply reversed the order of the facts, and he omitted the order for scourging Paul to actually put himself in a good light with Felix, his superior officer. And what he actually does is he poses himself as the protector of a fellow Roman citizen. Good man is Claudius Lysias. And then in verses 28 to 29, he now relates how he tried to find out the truth behind what was taking place. In verse 28, he describes the Sanhedrin meeting. And the reason for this meeting was because he wanted to discern the cause for which they accused him. He wanted to know fully what was going on. And the word accused means that the Sanhedrin, the Jews, kept accusing him. They kept repeating their charges against him. They just kept on and on and on about this man, Paul. So his act was to bring him down onto their council, meaning the Sanhedrin. But at this point, remember, they had their meeting in the Antonia fortress. That's where Paul is, and Claudius actually got the Sanhedrin, or members of them, to come up to the fortress. And the result of this meeting is in verse 29. It says, whom I found to be accused about questions of their law. In other words, the issues that all this mob uprising was about concerned Jewish law and not Roman law. But to have nothing laid to his charge, and so Claudius writes, he has nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or of bonds. There was nothing worthy in the charges of death or chains. Paul was innocent. There was no violation of Roman law, so there should be no reason for him to be even in chains. He was not worthy of being jailed, let alone being executed. So Paul is innocent of any crime. And in verse 30, what we see here is he points out here that he was bringing him to Felix. When it was shown to me that there would be a plot against a man, so the reason he's taking him to Felix was that there was a conspiracy against Paul by these 40 plus assassins. And then came the action. He said, I send him to you forthwith. The action here was that Claudius Lysias sent him up to Felix. He also charged his accusers to speak against Paul before Felix. So after Paul is gone, Lysias will go and tell the Sanhedrin, hey, you guys need to go up to Caesarea to explain your accusations before the governor Felix. Now we're going to move up to Caesarea in verse 31. So what we see here is this is Paul's arrival in Caesarea. It's the first leg of the journey from Jerusalem to a place called Antipatris. So the soldiers, as it was commanded them, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. Now, Antipatris, that's the Greek name. The name of the Old Testament Jewish city is Aphek. This was 35 miles from Jerusalem, and they headed up there during the night. So it was a very stiff, forced march by night. But then again, these are professional soldiers, so for them it's no big deal. But fortunately, Paul's riding on either a horse or a donkey or something like that, and that was to make certain that Paul could move quickly. And in verse 32, we have the second leg of the journey from Antipatris to Caesarea. But on the morrow, they left the horsemen to go with him. So now we have only the 70 horsemen from the cavalry. They continued the rest of the way from Antipatris to Caesarea, which is another 27 miles. And by this time, the other soldiers, the 200 heavily armed soldiers and the 200 spearmen, they now returned to the Antonia fortress. Why? Because the danger is no longer great. I mean, the Sanhedrin are not going to do a forced march to try and catch up with them. They didn't even know he's gone yet. So the 70 horsemen, the cavalry, could handle any other problems they might have. In verse 33, we see the arrival of the horsemen into Caesarea. It says, and they, the horsemen, when they came to Caesarea, did two things. First of all, they delivered the letter to the governor, and they gave up the letter to the governor, handed it over, and then they presented Paul before the governor. In verse 34 to 35, we have the actions of Felix. And in verse 34 is the questioning. The time was, and when he had read it, and that's the letter of Claudius Lysias, he asked Paul what province he came from. Literally, he asked him, what kind of province are you from? Are you from a senatorial province or an imperial province? Why did he need to know this? Because he needed to know whether it was under his jurisdiction to have a hearing for Paul. If it was not under his province, he'd have to pass it on. And the answer here was that Paul was from Cilicia. Cilicia at this time, it was not a full province, but it was under the legate of Syria, same as Israel. Israel was under the legate of Syria, and Felix, who was he? Well, he was a procurator of Judea, so he was a deputy of the legate of Syria. Therefore, he could legally hear the case. In verse 35, we have the decision that he made. And the decision was to hear him fully, give Paul a full hearing. And the timing, when are we going to do this? Well, when his accusers also arrived, and he commanded Paul to be kept in Herod's palace. So Paul was jailed in Herod's palace in Caesarea. And the Greek word here for palace means praetorian. It's a Latin word. It's used 5 different times in the Gospels. Now, just a bit of background. Its original meaning was the camp of the general, but later it became a name for the place or for the palace of the governor, as we see in Matthew 27, verse 27. And in this instance here also, it's the palace of the governor. In Philippians 1:3, the way it's used there, it was a name for the Praetorian Guard. Now, not only was Paul protected by an escort fit for a king. I mean, like, as we said, he had almost half the garrison as his escort, but he was put now not in a common prison, but he's actually put in the palace built by Herod the Great, and this is where the governor had his official headquarters. So he's in the palace, not bad for a prison. Paul did not look for the easy way out, did he? But for the way, Paul always looked for the way that was going to bring honor to his Lord and win the lost. He was even willing, here what we see here. I mean, he's a Roman citizen, and he was willing even here to become a prisoner if that would further the work of the gospel. And remember, Jesus did give him some assurance earlier on that, I got big jobs for you, mate. You'll be safe. You'll be safe until you finish all that I've called you to do. Now we're going to have Paul's defense before Governor Felix, and this is in verses. This is in verses 1 to 27. We have the charge in verses 1 to 9. And after 5 days, so he's been up there. After 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with certain elders and with an orator, one Tertullus, and they informed the governor against Paul. So verse 1 here gives the identities of the accusers. When did it all happen? It was after 5 days. It required 5 days for the Sanhedrin to get themselves organized and to get up to Caesarea. So they came down to Caesarea because anytime somebody leaves Jerusalem, they're always going down from Jerusalem. High priest was present. That's Ananias. Ananias, high priest, is a Sadducee. And he also brought along some elders, certain elders, the elders of the Pharisees. And the Pharisees that we have here were probably those Pharisees who didn't actually side with Paul earlier on. So it was not the entire Sanhedrin who came in. It was just the high priest along with some elders and some other Sadducees. They also bring along a guy, an orator named Tertullus. It means an orator simply is a public speaker, a rhetorician. He has the gift of the gab. He's basically an attorney. That's basically what he was. Tertullus is a Latin name, so that means he was probably a Gentile. Now, why did they bring him along? Well, because he would be needed, because he would be familiar with Roman law. Remember, the Sanhedrin wouldn't be, they're coming before the governor. They wouldn't be that familiar with Roman law, but Tertullus, he would be. And so they brought him along as their attorney, if you like, or as their, their spokesman. Now, the most important people who are missing, who are they? I mean, who was the one who started this whole kerfuffle in the first place? It was the Asian Jews. Remember, they're the ones who caused the riot, and they're the ones who caused the 40 conspirators. But so they should be here, because they're the ones who should be making the accusation to Governor Felix. And their deed they should be here informing the governor against Paul. So what we see here now with these guys who've come down with Ananias and some of the Sanhedrin, they now come to present a legal indictment against Paul. And in verses 2 to 8, we're going to see the actual charge against Paul. But remember, under Roman law, it's the accusers, the ones who made the original charge, should be there to give the information. In verse 2, first part of verse 2, we see the introduction and when he was called. So when Paul was brought into the room in their presence, Tertullus began to accuse him, and we see his accusation in the second part of verse 2 to verse 4. Before Tertullus brings the accusation, he's got to flatter Felix to make sure he has a good hearing. And so he begins by praising Felix. He first praises the rule of Felix in verse 2b, and he points out two things regarding Felix. He says, by Felix, they enjoyed much peace. Literally, he was saying to Felix, oh, Felix, because of you, we have obtained so much peace because of you. And this was pure flattery. It was actually pure rubbish. He's praising the governor for the peace that he had brought the nation. In fact, if you look into the records, in fact, under Felix, there was less peace in Judea during his administration than for any other procurator until the final years before the outbreak of war with Rome. He was the one who brought anything but peace. There were several uprisings because of Felix's misrule and his shocking treatment. The assassins rose up under him, and because of all of this, Rome eventually recalled him. So Tertullus is spinning bull dust. Second, Tertullus says that by the providence, evils are corrected for this nation. So what he's saying is that, he's saying that everything Tertullus Felix has done, it's just been such a blessing to this nation. Actually, Felix encouraged bands of thieves and he shared the spoil with them. So everything Tertullus said about Felix was actually a joke, but it wasn't funny at the time, but it was a joke. It was a joke would have been a joke even to the Sanhedrin, because they'd be thinking, man, this guy brought anything but peace to us. This guy's anything but a good guy. It was purely designed to flatter Felix and to win him over to their side. And in verse 3, he gives thanksgiving to Felix. We accept it in all ways and in all places. Most excellent Felix was a title of respect for one and authority. In other words, we are so glad that you're ruling with all gratitude. We're so glad of that. Now, Tertullus may have been very thankful, but the Jews who were with him were certainly not thankful, because he had in fact made life very miserable for the Jews, as seen simply by the many rebellious movements during his term in office. And that was in response to his total lack of sympathy for or any understanding of them. He wasn't interested in them. And in verse 4, he now makes a transition from flattering Felix to actually what the case at hand is. But that I be not further tedious unto you, more flattery, so as not to cut into your busy schedule, or to interrupt you any further. After all, I virtually saying, look, I know you're a busy man. I don't want to bang on anymore. Let's just get this over and done with. I entreat you to hear us of your clemency a few words. So he begs for Felix to hear a few words of accusation. And again, more flattery. That they made it sound as if Felix was doing them a favor by hearing the case. It was his job. In verse 5 to 6, we have the charge against Paul. The charge against Paul contains 4 indictments here. First of all, for we have found this man a pestilent fellow. In other words, Paul is a public pest. He's a public nuisance. The Greek word means pest or pestilence or plague. Paul is a plague, right? Second, he's a mover of insurrections among all the Jews throughout the world. In other words, he tends to stir Jews to revolt. And this now is an accusation of sedition against Rome. And what they're saying is that he is a worldwide starter of riots. And that's what the accusation against Paul is here. Now, that would be ringing bells with Felix. Third, he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. And the word sect here, what does it tell us? It means that they, as far as they were concerned, it was simply a sect still within Judaism. So this shows us here that the Jewish believers were still viewed as being part of the Jewish party. The term Nazarenes, why does he use Nazarenes here? Well, the term Nazarenes was an early name given to Jewish believers, all right? Gentile believers were called Christians. Jewish believers, they were called Nazarenes, the Nazarenes. And this was the early name for them. The word ringleader, Tertullus says that he was a ringleader. He's saying, listen, he was a champion. He was a chief. He was the front-ranked man of this sect of the Nazarenes. And the fourth accusation, he says, who, moreover, essayed to profane the temple. Now, what he's saying is Paul was a temple profaner with whom Rome had no right to interfere. That's what he's saying. He said, listen, this guy is a temple profaner. It has nothing to do with Rome. It's simply a Jewish matter. Now, we got to remember here that because Rome allowed the Jews to kill Gentiles who were caught within the inner court of the temple, even if they were Roman citizens. Remember, we spoke about the fact that, that between the inner and outer court, we had a partition wall, a boundary wall, and on that boundary wall, there were signs that says that, hey, warning, you Gentiles, if you go through these gates here into the inner court, we have every right to kill you. You are now taking your life into your own hands. Whether you're a Roman citizen or not, the Roman government gave them the authority to do that. Now, Paul, remember, Paul had been charged by the Asian Jews, the Jews from Ephesus. Remember, they saw Trophimus with Paul in Jerusalem, and they wrongly thought, hey, Paul has taken Trophimus into the inner court. Now, had Tertullus, proved these charges, it would have obligated Felix to then turn over Paul to the Sanhedrin, to the jurisdiction of the Sanhedrin, and that would have meant almost certain death. So they charged here, Tertullus, the Jewish Sanhedrin, charged Paul with profaning the temple, on whom also we laid hold. So it was on this last charge for which Paul was arrested. This is what Tertullus is claiming. It's all Felix. It's all about the fact that he profaned the temple. That's all that it's about here. That's what all the commotion is about. And so really, it has nothing to do with Roman law. You really need to give him back to the Sanhedrin, let them deal with it. But Tertullus is making a false statement here. The truth here is that Paul was mobbed. He wasn't arrested. He was almost killed by the mob. He was not arrested by the Sanhedrin or by the Chiliarch or by the captain of the guard. He was almost killed by a mob which was interspersed with spasms of rage. Now, these few verses here, some of your Bibles might have them in it, some might not. If you get the King James, for instance, verses, second part of verse 6, first part of verse, the end of the first part of verse 8, they're inserted into the King James Version because it follows the Textus Receptus, and so we have this line in there. However, these verses are not part of the original, the best known manuscripts, the original manuscripts. So they're probably not part of the original text. So we'll pass that. Now, in verse 8, what we have here in verse 8, we have the verification of these charges. And he says, from whom you will be able. So he's talking to Felix. He says, from whom you'll be able. What he's saying is, Felix, you'll be able to obtain the truth from Paul by examining him yourself. You know, you can find these charges for yourself, Felix. So the result here will be to take knowledge of all these things where we're accusing Paul. And you know, they feel pretty confident that Felix will be able to discover the truth of the accusations. So Felix, we're going to hand him over to you to have an inquiry. In verse 9, we have the affirmation by the others, and the Jews also joined in the charge. So the Jews here, who are in contrast to Tertullus himself, who was a Roman, they're now joining in. So they've made a joint attack here. And the others also began affirming that these things were indeed so. Oh yes, yes, Felix, absolutely yes. All these charges are absolutely true, Felix. We're at one in this, and all these charges are certainly true. Now we're going to have Paul's defense. And in verse 10, we have the introduction to the defense of Paul. So the governor called Paul to speak. He beckoned on him to speak. He gave him the nod. He says, go ahead, Paul, it's your turn. So Paul's now free to answer the charges, and he began to make his defense. Now, Paul has an introduction, and he talks to Felix as well. He says, Felix, he doesn't like Felix, he says, for as much as I know that you have been of many years a judge unto this nation. Now, in Paul's case, there's no flattery here. It's a simple statement of fact. He had been. Paul simply said that for many years, Felix was a judge over the nation. And what he means by many years is that by this time, Felix had been the procurator for about 7 years. However, prior to that, he had been a military commander in Israel prior to becoming procurator. Nevertheless, he had been a leader in the nation for many years. So Paul says, okay, that's who you are. And Paul now says that he cheerfully made his defense. Paul says, look, I'm making my defense in good spirits to you, Felix, because, you know, I'm happy to defend himself. I'm happy to defend myself of the charges before someone who by now, you know, had learned or understood some things concerning Jewish law, because you've been around here for a very long time. You know, you understand a few things about Jewish law. And then in verse 11, he points out exactly what he actually did in Jerusalem. He says, seeing that you can take knowledge, what's he saying here? He says, listen, in other words, Felix, you can verify what I'm going to tell you now, because you can find out this for certain. The content of what I'm going to tell you is, being that it is not more than 12 days since I went up to Jerusalem. He's only been there for 12 days. He went up there for 12 days. Been 12 days since he went to Jerusalem to worship. What's that going to do with it? Well, Felix, that 12 days wasn't enough time to begin a revolt, mate, you know. But why did he go up? He went up because he goes up to Jerusalem. He always goes up to Jerusalem. A Jew always goes up to Jerusalem and down from Jerusalem. His purpose was to go and worship. He said, I went to Jerusalem to worship. Remember, he was heading back from his mission trip to get back to Jerusalem for Pentecost. So he's going down to Jerusalem for Pentecost, the Feast of Pentecost. So, you know, he was not there to start a riot. You know, he was not a public pest. He was just a Jew going to worship at Pentecost. In fact, you know, the temple records would show that Paul was registered to pay. Remember, he took a Nazirite vow to, you know, prove his he was still on board with the Jewish system. Temple records would show that he paid the costs for 4 other Jewish men who had taken the Nazarite vow as well. So, you know, you got to check the records, mate. I'm not down there to cause a riot or to cause sedition. He said, I went to worship, and while I was there, I had to take this Nazarite vow with these guys, and, you know, temple records will show you that. Neither in the temple, in verse 12, he makes 2 points here in verse 12. First of all, he says, contrary to their charges, I didn't stir up any revolts down there. He says, they did not find him in the temple disputing with anybody, with any man. What disputing means, he said, I was not arguing, I was not conversing, I was not discussing with any man. He said, I went there to worship. Second, he said, I wasn't stirring up any crowd. And the word for stirring up a crowd means to make a rush. He said, you know, I didn't do any of that. I didn't do either of these things in the temple compound. And he also adds here that I didn't do it in any of the synagogues, nor in the temple in Jerusalem. So Paul denies the charges, all of these charges which were punishable under Roman law. He was not a mover of insurrections. He stirred up no one to revolt against Rome. He simply went there to worship. And in verse 13, he points out the evidence of that. He says, neither can they prove to you the things whereof they now accuse me. In other words, they can't prove to Felix all these accusations that they have made against me. His accusers could not prove a time, any time, when Paul instigated a revolt. Paul had not preached in the temple or the synagogues, nor had he preached anywhere in the city. Years before, Paul had made an agreement with Peter and the Jerusalem elders that he would not evangelize the Jews in Jerusalem. And you can see that in Galatians chapter 2, verse 7 to 10. He recognized that Peter was the apostle to the Jews, and he was called to be the apostle to the Gentiles. And so he left Jerusalem to Peter, the apostle to the Jews, and to the elders down there. So nobody could prove that he was guilty of leading any kind of rebellion against the Jews or the Romans. And in verses 14 to 16, he turns to the charge that he's a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. And this 14 to 16, we see Paul the Nazarene. And he begins here by pointing out something about the way. The way, in verse 14. But this I confess unto you, Felix, that after the way, which they call a sect. In other words, remember the way is the early term used for those who follow Jesus. It's a very common name in the book of Acts for this new faith. Now, in other words, Paul is saying, yes, it is true that, yes, I am a Nazarene, but being a Nazarene is not a crime. And being a follower of the way, that's not a crime. But what they do say here is, Paul says, he says they call a sect, right? The word sect means division. So Paul obviously saw the way as being a fulfillment of the whole of Judaism. He didn't view it as merely a sect or a division within Judaism. So serve I the God of our fathers, he goes on to say. Who were the fathers? Well, the fathers are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In other words, what's he saying? What he's saying is that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is now to be worshipped through this new way. The fact that Paul was a Christian did not mean that he worshipped a different God from the God of his fathers. It only meant he worshipped the God of his fathers in a new and living way. Because remember, from then on, the only acceptable way to worship the Father is through Jesus Christ. And we see that in John 5, verse 23. So Paul is saying, hey, I don't see this as being a sect of Judaism. I see this as being the fulfillment of Judaism. And I see this as now being the only way that one can worship God the Father, and that is through this way. And clearly, the new way is through Jesus of Nazareth, because this means Paul is believing all things which are according to the law. The way is a fulfillment of the law. It says, and which are written in the prophets. So this way, this new faith, is also a fulfillment of the prophets. It's a fulfillment of the law. It's a fulfillment of the prophet. Now, his faith was still founded on the Old Testament scriptures, but the Old Testament scriptures bore witness to Jesus Christ. Therefore, he did not deny that he was a Nazarene. However, in this capacity, he was serving the God of Israel. He worshiped the God of Israel. And in verse 15, he turns to the real issue, and the real issue is the issue of the resurrection. Having hope toward God. What hope? The hope of the resurrection, which these also themselves look for. See, Paul once again, they also look for the hope of the resurrection. Who? The Pharisees did. The Sadducees who were there listening to Paul's defense, they didn't. but the Pharisees did. The Sadducees didn't look for the hope of the resurrection because they didn't believe in it. But the Pharisees, like Paul, believe that there shall be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. The resurrection of the just, what's that? That'll be the first resurrection, the believers. Resurrection of the unjust will be the second resurrection, the unbelievers. In verse 16, he tells them about his conscience. Herein I also exercise myself to have a conscience. The word means I take pains or labor or I strive. In other words, Paul is saying, I'm devoid of any offense toward God and men. My conscience is clear, he says. I'm not doing anything that causes others to stumble. So this is a reaffirming of what Paul said back in Acts 23, verse 1. Now he turns to deal with another charge, that he's a profaner of the temple. Verses 17 to 19, he points out here that he's not a profaner of the temple. In verse 17, he gives the background. He says, now after some years, this is after his third missionary journey, the purpose for which he came, he says, is I came down after my third missionary journey, after many years, I came down to bring alms to my nation and offerings. So this is the only time here that this purpose is mentioned in the book of Acts. It's mentioned in several other epistles like Romans 15, 25 to 28, 1 Corinthians 16, 1 to 4, 2 Corinthians 8, 1 to 14, and 9, 12 to 13, and Galatians 2, 10. So this is the mention of the fact that he's bringing alms and contribution to the brothers down here. In most of these cases, these epistles, except for Galatians 2:10, he's dealing with coming to Jerusalem on this trip after his third missionary journey to give alms. And this is the only place where this event is actually mentioned. Now, Paul said that he came to give alms to the nation, right? He came to give alms to the poor of the church of Jerusalem. But what Paul is saying here is that as far as Paul is concerned, the Jewish believers did not separate themselves from the nation, but they were part of the nation. So he says, as far as I'm concerned, I'm giving alms to the nation, even though it's the poor Jewish believers. So to bring alms to them was the same as bringing alms to the nation. And Jewish believers were still part of the nation of Israel. And these alms were specifically for the church of Jerusalem. He also mentioned offerings. What offerings? Well, it's the offerings for the Feast of Pentecost. In verse 18, first part, he spells out his role in the temple, amidst which they found me purified in the temple. So while he was performing the offerings, he mentioned in verse 17, at that point, the others began the riot. And Paul's state in the temple compound was that he was with no crowd and neither with a tumult. The point he makes is that, listen, I was just in the temple alone. I brought no Gentiles within. He didn't in any way profane the temple compound. In fact, he went there to worship in the temple. I mean, if a man's going to go and worship in the temple, he's not going to go and profane the temple. But he points at the true instigators in the second part of verse 8, and he says, I was there on my own, minding my own business, worshiping. But he says the Jews from Asia, these guys were the true instigators of the riot. I'm not guilty. And in verse 19, he goes on to say here that the Jews from Asia who caused the riot, those guys ought to have been here before you. But they were not here. They're not before Felix. They were the ones who should be before Felix. Since they were the original accusers, they should be present. And the reason they should be present is we should hear the accusation from their mouth. It's their responsibility to make the accusation. And the reason is that if they had anything against me, if these Jews from Ephesus, the Asian Jews, had anything against me, they should be here before you, Felix. But those guys have probably gone back to Ephesus by this time. Verses 20 to 21, Paul points out to the present accusers. In verse 20, he says, the present witnesses, or else, verse 20, let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the council. So what he's saying is, these guys here, let them say what wrongdoing I did. The Jews of Asia are not present. So can these guys here present, who are secondary accusers, testify to any wrongdoing on my part? So when Paul stood before the council, this is when he makes this comment. He makes a reference here to the time he stood before the Sanhedrin, and we see this in when he was back earlier on in Acts 22, verse 30 to 23:10. And even back then, they couldn't find any crime within him. In verse 21, he turns now to the real issue, which is the resurrection. Except it be for this one voice that I cried standing among them, this one voice. The thing that Paul said which caused the division in the Sanhedrin, and his voice was, touching the resurrection of the dead, I am called in question before you this day. The real issue here was the resurrection. It is the resurrection in general, but more specifically, it is the resurrection of Jesus Christ, which is the evidence of his messiahship. And the conclusion here is simply this. That which was criminal, not true of Paul. He was not guilty of any criminal act. Paul was innocent. The one charge of which Paul was guilty was that he was a Nazarene, and that charge was not criminal. It later became a crime, but it was not a crime at this point. And that is the end of, or for today.